find this very interesting. I've heard Dr. Boreham speak a number of times in the past, and not only gets the message across clear, he gets it across effectively. So I think you're really
well. That's always sets the stage on that, right? What can I say? if I'm bad at the end, I go, what is Peter talking about? Anyways, like Peter said, we'll go through this informally. Originally, we were going to do this without an audience, but it's a lot easier to talk to people, especially if they aren't falling asleep. But so I'll try and avoid that. So I was asked a while back, actually, from Peter to talk about some of this this radiation and cosmic radiation and flying, and he sent me this this brochure that was put out, presumably for Air Canada, for the Air Canada people, because there's lots of information on there about pilots and radiation exposures they get. So I went through it, I looked at it, and I thought I'd put it in the context of, let's talk about what radiation is, where it comes from, what you get exposed to naturally. Is this any different than what you would normally get exposed to? And what are some of the things we know about effects of radiation on pilots and on aircrew? What are the effects of radiation on people at low doses that we're talking about? And I'll talk a little bit at the end, if we have time, about some of the science, so we can learn that we're actually doing leading edge science and figuring out some of this stuff in terms of real effects. So I'm a professor here at McMaster University, and I also work at Bruce Power. Let's see if I can get this to work. So I'll just give you a bit of my history. I came from a uranium mining town called Elliott Lake. It's in northern Ontario. My dad was a uranium miner. I worked in the uranium mines in the summer while I was trying to put my way through college and university. I went to a school, Elliott Lake High School. You can't see it there, but that sign actually says ELSS, home of the Atoms. So our sports teams were called the Atoms. So everyone knew when we were coming to town, they could throw shots at us about radiation, glowing in the dark, stuff like that. One way to try and slow us down. We had good teams, though, so they couldn't say too much. I went off to college after high school and got my aircraft maintenance engineering diploma, and was going to get into the field of being AME. But that didn't pan out, because in those days, nobody was hiring these people, so I went off to university. I was always interested in radiation, understanding radiation, so eventually finished my PhD at University of Ottawa. I worked at AECL, Atomic Energy of Canada, for approximately 14 years, 4 years finishing my PhD and another 10 as their scientists, their radiation biology and health physics. Then at McMaster University for 12 years. Started at Bruce Power about 4 years ago when they started with the idea of building new reactors in Canada, and they needed some educational outreach, so I started working for them as their department manager for environment and eventually in integration. I put this up here because I have 26 years of research experience in the health effects of radiation. This is actually an image we took here at McMaster University. It's a shadow of a person. You see the person's head here, shoulders, the lungs, the spinal cord, and here's a dark area. This is a lung tumor in a person. This is done with a positron emission tomography scan, so we can detect cancers growing inside of people. This picture of this lung tumor is actually my dad's lung tumor, and automatically people say, well, he was a uranium miner. Lung tumor. And there is lots of evidence that says in the old days when we were mining uranium and doing lots of nasty things like smoking cigarettes and drinking lots of alcohol and not having any ventilation in the mines, there was an increased risk in some of the miners from getting lung cancer from this exposure, largely because of the dust particles and things like that. But I put this up because it's a good example of, if we know what's going on in science, we can actually work out where things happen. This actually is a tumor called mesothelioma, which is associated with asbestos. And he worked in an asbestos mine for many years before he became a uranium miner. So you add all these things up, and risk does definitely go up. So I went on the internet and looked up. So the first thing you put in, if you put pilots and radiation and ask for an image, this will come up and say, these guys were pilots in space and were exposed to space radiation. That's what you get, right? So if you just type in pilots and radiation, that will come up. So I would expect the people that see that would say, well, I probably don't want to end up like that, so this radiation must not be good for me. And again, you may want to be a superhero. I don't know. What I want to talk to you about today are a number of different things. I want to talk about sources of your radiation exposure. I'd like to talk to you about what galactic cosmic radiation is, give you some idea of what radiation units are. Radiation units are a terrible thing. There's all sorts of different units for all sorts of different things, and we have different systems working in different countries, and trying to figure it out, even at my stage of the game, I'll have to sit there sometimes with a napkin and write down numbers and go, what is that dose? I can't work it out. So I don't blame anyone who doesn't do this every day, just to say this stuff is too confusing. So I'll try and talk to you a little bit about doses, a bit about the exposure the Air Canada pilots and crew get, talk about radiation from natural stuff, some health effects, and like I said, I'll show you some evidence at the end about some research we do. So radiation is everywhere. Radiation is as natural as air and water. It's on our planet, it's everywhere. We use it for a number of things, everywhere from radios to microwaves, infrared, but this is called the electromagnetic spectrum. And depending upon the wavelength of the particle, the photons you have, or the photons you have, basically you get increasing shorter wavelength, higher energy, and at some point the energy of your radiation has the ability to ionize molecules. That's why it's called ionizing radiation. So if I said, are you afraid of radiation, you might want to say, well, what type of radiation? I'm not really afraid of a microwave or invisible light or a telephone or radio waves, but I might be afraid of overexposure to ionizing radiation because we use it for a number of things. So in the past, we would say that if you were exposed to radiation over your lifetime, approximately 80% of the radiation you get exposed to as a human would come from natural things. 80% natural. And about 20% would come from man-made things. Well, in the last sort of 5 to 10 years, we've worked out that, in fact, that's more like 50-50 now. And why would that be? Well, the reason for that is because we're getting more man-made radiation through medical procedures. So roughly 50% of your radiation, on average over a human's lifetime, will come from man-made, and the other 50% will come from natural stuff. So in the beginning, of course, it all started with the Big Bang theory. We had lots of radioactivity. We had a whole bunch of blobs flying around the universe, and all of a sudden solar systems were formed. Our solar system formed with a sun in the middle, again spewing off. So if we look at natural background radiation, it contributes about 50% of your lifetime exposure, like I said. And the two main sources are cosmic radiation and terrestrial radiation. I put sort of different proportions up here for you because when it comes down to it, cosmic radiation on the Earth's surface accounts for about 10% of your natural exposure to radiation, whereas terrestrial stuff, 70% comes from a substance called radon, which I'll describe in a minute, and some internal emitters we have and some external emitters we have. So let's talk about cosmic radiation first. Unfortunately, that light is obscuring this a bit, but we can define cosmic radiation as two different types or sources of radiation. One coming from our sun, which is solar cosmic radiation, and radiation coming from all the other suns in the universe, so the stars. Streaming radioactive particles and photons in every direction possible, and coming from outer space many billions of years ago. It's called galactic cosmic radiation, or GCR and SCR. We can just call it cosmic radiation because the origin of where it comes from generally won't impact the types of radiation we're going to get. So what about cosmic radiation? Well, cosmic radiation is extraterrestrial particles coming from outer space. In space, like when you're in space itself, so if you're actually out of the atmosphere, that cosmic radiation basically is comprised of these types of particles. 50% of them are protons. And I'll talk to you about protons, alpha particles, and electrons a little later. But these are basically charged particles that are moving through space at almost the speed of light. And when they hit something, they interact with it, and they deposit their energy in it. In this particular picture here, you'll see that this is the northern lights. And when those particles actually are traveling through space and actually hit the Earth and start interacting with the molecules in the Earth's atmosphere, largely nitrogen and oxygen, they dissipate their energy off. And you can see that in the form of wavelengths of light, and other scattered particles are produced. So in space, they're made of this. But when we start getting interactions and losing energy in the atmosphere, we see that we get other secondary particles produced like neutrons. And depending on where you are in the atmosphere, what altitude you're at, you can have different ratios of these things. There's a map of cosmic ray exposure in North America. And I'm not even going to talk to you about this yet, but this is the dose rate you get per hour. And what's the first thing that jumps out at you? Where's the highest dose rates? Well, the purple colors. And the purple colors are the highest elevations. So just by changing your elevation on this planet, you're getting different rates of cosmic radiation on the surface. So you can imagine when you change your altitude in terms of your career or your occupation, you're going to get different levels of radiation exposure. All right, so galactic cosmic radiation. This is a picture of the sun, cartoon, solar flare coming off. And as you know, solar flares or coronal mass ejections will actually produce ionizing radiation that spews out from the sun. We had one a couple of weeks ago that was basically fairly large. They were talking about knocking out telecommunications and things. These things spew towards the Earth. This is supposed to be the Earth here, a little circle. And the blue lines represent the magnetic field around the Earth. So our first sort of shield against cosmic radiation and galactic radiation is the magnetic field. And you can probably see that there's kind of a almost like a force field where the cosmic radiation is being shielded here, and you get some kind of bands forming where the cosmic radiation is being sort of filtered or funneled by the magnetic field. And that's protecting us largely from many of the things, especially the solar flares, this magnetic field around the Earth. Consequently, you can see that when it comes around, it's coming to the South Pole and the North Pole. That's where we're picking up the northern lights, because it's deflecting it to the South and North Pole. So you can see it at night interacting with the atmospheric molecules. Well, cosmic radiation health, aircrew and frequent flyers. Like I said, we get shielding from our atmosphere is reduced if you're up higher in the atmosphere. If you're down on the Earth's surface, it's one thing. But as you get higher, 30,000 feet, you don't have that 30,000 feet of atmosphere to shield you from the stuff that gets by the magnetic fields. Magnetic field deflects most of the low energy cosmic rays. The upper atmosphere is mostly nitrogen and oxygen. And on the surface, you get about a 100-fold decrease in cosmic radiation levels compared to if you didn't have atmosphere in general from space. And of course, if you're working at high altitudes, there's less protection than on the ground from this amount of radiation and this form of radiation. Now, this is the part where people will fall asleep, and you can go ahead and take a quick mini nap if you want, but I still have to tell you this stuff. And it's very frustrating for me to actually go through this, but nonetheless, when we talk about dose, we have to talk about absorbed dose. This is energy that's going to be absorbed into your tissues. And you can measure dose in terms of energy. And energy can be measured in units called joules per kilogram. So dose, the unit for that, the SI unit, the international standard, is Gray. Some people use the word rad. A lot of people use rads, but we're going to stick with the SI units here. I want to say it's Gray, and spelled Gray that way. And the symbol for it is GY, and it's a joule per kilogram energy absorbed per unit mass. So that's just energy. But now we're talking about all these different types of radiation, different charged particles, different types of masses of things that are interacting with things. And when they interact with us, or living things, they have sort of a different effect on us in terms of how much energy they put into our tissues. And based on the effect that they have, we can assign numbers to them. So we call that a radiation weighting factor, and it's based on the radiation quality. So electrons and photons, so gamma rays and X-rays, we just say that's 1. Protons have a little higher number, and alpha particles have about 10 times higher number. And that just means that there's 10 times the biological effect when the same dose of radiation hits you. Okay? Well, if you're still with me on that, we'll move down to equivalent dose. And that's just another unit we can use to basically say that now what we're going to do is take all the stuff, take for energy and weighting factors of the radiation quality, and turn it into what we call an equivalent dose, and that unit is a sievert. Sieverts and Grays, that's all I'm going to go with today, because we talk about sieverts in this, and all your numbers are given in sieverts, microsieverts and nanosieverts, but nonetheless sieverts. A Gray and a sievert are exactly the same thing if we're talking about protons and electrons, because it's 1. There's no difference between the two. When you do calculations like this, if you had a dose of 0.15 Gray of gamma rays, which is 1, and 0.02 Grays of neutrons, which carry 20, you just do the calculation, now you come up with a dose. It's called an equivalent dose because it's not really dose. That's the toughest part for most people to understand. It's an equivalent dose. We're going to say that allows us to normalize all this stuff and say, all right, it's all sorts of different particles. Space radiation has all these different things, but we're going to normalize it into one sort of unit called the sievert, and we'll use that to talk to you about what we think the dose has in terms of a risk weighting factor to it. All right, so we got our unit. We're going to talk about sieverts for the rest of this lecture or this seminar, and it's SV. 1 sievert is 1,000 millisieverts. Millisievert? 1,000th of a sievert is a millisievert, and 1 millisievert is 1,000 microsieverts. So I'll be talking about sieverts, microsieverts, and millisieverts as we go through this. It's the unit we're going to use, and just so you don't get confused, you have this slide. In fact, we have this presentation. We can make some hard copies of it. I should have made some before we came, but I didn't. So this is not a picture of Air Canada crew. Unfortunately, I looked on Air Canada crew on the internet, and there's all sorts of pictures there, but I can't get a picture of the crew with an Air Canada jet behind it. So I got this air crew. What does this air crew get exposed to occupationally from galactic cosmic radiation? It's about 1 to 2 times natural background radiation, which works out to 2 to 4 millisieverts. Okay? So natural background radiation, I'll talk to you about getting about 1 to 2 times above what you're naturally going to get anyways by flying on average in general, being air crew. So we have to talk about what natural background radiation is before you get a handle on what that means. I'll just show you the distribution that was in this particular handout you guys got. There's lots of interesting information here about dose in here. One of the graphs they show is how much radiation dose pilots get, number of pilots that get exposed to the different dose ranges over the year, the annual dose. So 0.5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 millisieverts of dose. The average exposure in Canada from natural background radiation is 2 millisieverts. So you go here, it's about 2 millisieverts. You know, almost 600 pilots on average will get twice natural background radiation. The biggest sort of group is about here, over 900 are in the range between 2.5 and 3 millisieverts, and there's a few people out here. You get up to about 4 or 4.5. If you actually look at it, I'm trying to do this so we don't, you look at some of these sort of summary slides. If you look at the Air Canada results for 2009, based on this information, I put the reference here, 100% of people were below 6 millisieverts dose per year. Now 6 millisievert dose has been set by some regulator, presumably Transport Canada or something, that says this is an intervention level. Now, I have no idea what an intervention level means. It just means someone better talk to somebody about something, presumably, if you get this dose.
It's actually a labor level.
Okay, so it's a labor thing. All right, so what you do, I don't know, but what you do when you get to that level is probably interesting, because most people don't know what that means, including your physician or anybody. No, so it just sort of says, oh, you got that dose, probably we might want to restrict you from flying whatever, right? I don't know. Yeah. No one's near that, so we don't have to worry about it. And at least at this stage, and I don't think anyone will get above it. It's a really low dose of radiation, but nonetheless it's been set that way. For nuclear workers in the nuclear business, we set it at 20 millisieverts a year. So that's the dose you can get every year for 5 years. The highest pilot got 4.8. And the other thing that was pointed out in this brochure was that pilots flying polar routes on the 777 were not more exposed. And it's probably because they fly at lower altitudes. You guys know more about that than I do. Right, so if you're flying the lower altitudes, you're getting less cosmic radiation, so presumably, all right, where are we here? So this is another interesting graph they showed, and when you first look at it, you go, oh, the annual dose against percentage of pilots that get this dose. And if you look here, the tallest one is 62.5% of pilots get somewhere between 2 and millisieverts when they fly the 777, okay? So you say, oh, that looks like it's the highest thing, but that's actually not the highest dose, right? That's just telling you that most people are in the lower dose range of 2 to 3, which is, again, just 1 times more than you naturally get here in Canada. I'm going to tell you about what people get in other places of the world in a minute. So keep in mind, 2 is the number we get in Canada. 2 is where most of your pilots are getting their dose. And
Is that additional to the 2?
Yep.
So that's over top of background?
That is what they get from flying, yeah. That's their occupational exposure. Right. And then, of course, you got out here where you get the 4 to 5, and I think the number 1 guy with 4.8 was flying the EMJ, Embraer. Yeah. So there's your sort of distribution of what people get. So now this dose is not measured. That's another important thing you have to understand. Because it's complicated with all the different types of radiation, the altitude you fly at, the time you're at that altitude, so on and so forth, there's very complicated models that are created to reconstruct this dose that you're getting. And that's what this brochure was about, is reconstructing the dose, the effective dose that people are getting from flying in these aircraft for time, distance, elevation, altitude, etc. So that's it there. It's a fairly nice graph. It says to me that everybody is getting really low amounts of radiation overall from a biological perspective. So let's talk just real briefly about some people that don't have the atmosphere to protect them. I was fortunate enough to go down to the STS-118 launch that they had a few years back with the space shuttle. I have Chris Hadfield here, who now is the commander on the International Space Station, or he was, or he's about to do it. He's about to be. He's signing a bottle of Vineland Estate Riesling for me. So, and now, the reason I did that is because I wanted to bring it back to my friend who makes the wine there. My friend back there, the winemaker. And I met Julie Payette at the same time. But really, the reason I was down there was to deal with Dave Williams, who is a Canadian astronaut, which is right here. And Dave was going up. And what we were doing was we were part of a study where we were taking blood samples from astronauts before and after they go into space to look at what type of effects the space radiation has on them without the shielding of the atmosphere. And these guys are up there for quite a long time. They don't have any shielding. And we do see effects in some of their cells when they get back. And some of the things that we're seeing in astronauts are increased incidence of things like cataracts. It's still debatable whether there's any other thing we can see, but certainly cataracts seem to be coming up in astronauts. This is just a picture of what we do. This is Dave Williams' his DNA. I'm sure he'd be happy for me to show you his DNA because he actually taught here with me for a few years. He taught at the university, and I had him come into many of my classes and talk to the first year students about how you become, you know, an emergency room doctor, a surgeon, an astronaut, a pilot, like all that stuff on top of one after another. It gives them a little bit of inspiration when they start whining about the fact they're in first year university. Got a ways to go. But that's his stuff. He does have, I put it up here because he does have a little issue with this chromosome. It's supposed to be that long, but it's a little longer, which is not a big deal. I won't get into that. All right, so let's talk about natural background again. Remember I said that 10% of the natural background radiation is coming from cosmic radiation on the Earth's surface. The other 90% is coming from the Earth itself. Because it was a radioactive blob when it started, all the radioactive elements on it have subsequently been decaying with time as the Earth's been formed. And this rock over here is a rock that I got from Elliott Lake. And this is a little detector that tells me if there's any energy in this rock. And I can put this on. Can you hear that beeping sound? That's just telling me that there's radiation in the room. That's part cosmic radiation, terrestrial radiation. It's picking it up. Every time that beeps, that's some kind of ionization event happening. And it's happening in your body right now too. If I put the uranium rock close to it, you'll see there's some energy coming out of this rock. Okay, so this is uranium coming out of the rock. The half-life of uranium is about 4.6 billion years old. And so the uranium that was formed, the uranium that was here when this planet formed, actually is half gone now. We worked out the Earth's age based on the half-life of uranium. So 4.6 billion years ago, we had uranium. Now we got half the uranium left because it's been decaying away. And it's on this planet and it's everywhere. And all the decay products that it takes to get from uranium, which is radioactive, down to lead, which is not radioactive, takes many, many years. 4.6 billion years to be roughly approximate. And, but the interesting about that is that because it takes so long for this rock that has uranium in it to dissipate its energy, it interacts with our living tissue very, very slowly. Very slowly. So it's low dose rate, low amount of energy over a long period of time, which is why it's not harmful to me right now, and I'm holding it. It's giving off radiation, but it's giving off at such a low rate that, you know, we can detect it with these sensitive detectors, but from a biological point of view, the dose rate is very, very low. I'll turn that off because I left it on once and someone was videotaping and it drove them nuts on the taping. So, all right, so this is the Earth. It's radioactive. It has all these radioactive elements on it. Largely all of them coming from uranium and thorium. Well, let's talk about some dose rates that people get living on this Earth based on different proportions of these radioactive materials in our terrestrial environment. This is a picture of a place in Iran, Ramsar, Iran, and this dose rate is not because they have a nuclear program going on, maybe, I don't know. I'm just saying that this is natural background radiation. They have these naturally radioactive spas and springs that produce 200 to 700 millisieverts per year of radiation for the people living there. Now think about that. You get 2 millisieverts in Canada. You might get another 2, 3, or 4 if you're an airline pilot. But if you're living here, you're going to get 2 to 700 millisieverts a year. So you would say to yourself, was there anything wrong with these people? Have we studied them? And yes, we have. We've studied them extensively. And there's no scientific evidence that says there's any abnormal effects from even this high dose rate on an annual basis of radiation to these people. The only thing about them is if we take blood samples from them and challenge their cells in the lab and test them for their radiation response, they tend to do better, sort of warding off the effects of radiation than our cells do. A paper just came out last month talking about other abnormalities in these populations, and again showing that there is no effect on malformation, on congenital malformations and things like that. So we know that even in high areas, 100 times more than we get here, the biological effects are not being seen. Here's just an example of different areas around the world that have, you know, there's a beach in Brazil up to 800 millisieverts a year, 700 in Iran, Southwest France, 88. It goes down and down and down, even in Sweden, until we get down to sort of the world average, where we are, around 2. Again, what aircrew would get would be 4. Less than actually in a year, less than what's going on in Chernobyl now if you're there for a year. It was ironic to me and quite interesting that the exclusion zone they made for Fukushima when that accident happened, the zone that you had to get out of and you could not be living in, was set at 20 millisieverts per year. And when I show this to my students, they go, well, shouldn't they evacuate the beach in India? Shouldn't they evacuate you know, this place in Brazil, it's way higher in terms of radiation. Why? But it's just what we do in terms of protecting people. It's called ALARA, as low as reasonably achievable. But there's always a caveat in there, as low as reasonably achievable, provided that it's not going to cause any social or medical harm. I mean, you can go low enough, but if you go too low and you're causing some impact on society, you shouldn't go that low. People always like to say, let's just keep it as low as reasonably achievable, but you need to actually think about what is the impact. Well, what was the impact of excluding workers, safety workers, emergency workers, and other people in an area that was devastated by a tsunami and may still have people in there? It had a big impact. And if you look at Chernobyl, the biggest impact of Chernobyl was the psychological effects of Chernobyl, evacuating people from that area, taking away from their homes and telling them they could never come back. So a lot of suicides, a lot of alcoholism, a lot of things went on because people were told that this was a bad thing. And it was at the time, but since then we've sort of realized that all the things we thought were going to happen from Chernobyl never actually did. So here's Canada again, 2 milligray per year. That should be millisievert, but I've got milligray there. Wrong slide. It's the same thing because we're talking about normalizing it. These are just different countries. And you can see most of these countries hover around 2 millisieverts a year, the dose you're getting on average for most pilots on a yearly basis. And then you've got some higher places that are up to 8. Spain, Sweden up to 6. So just to give you a relative perspective of the types of radiation that we're getting naturally from the Earth.
And Doug, just to confirm, those are averages for the whole country. There
Yep.
are spots in the country
Hot
that are
spots.
quite a bit above that.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, there is. These are all average numbers. And you have to take these numbers with a grain of salt, right? There could be different things. All right. Let's talk about natural background radioactivity. Well, I told you that it all starts with uranium, and it decays away, and we get all these other products from it, like radium and polonium. We also have other things like thorium. Potassium-40 is one that was formed when the Earth formed. It's still here. Very long half-life. It's still around. It's decaying away. It'll eventually all disappear with many, many years to go. But basically, it's still here today. Same with carbon-14. Has a long half-life. So we breathe it. We eat it. We ingest it. It gets into our body. We are radioactive people, organisms. And if you look at how much that radioactivity from these elements are in our body and ask how much radioactive decays are going on per day in our body just from the stuff we eat and breathe, you get these numbers. Every day, about 10,000 alpha particles go off in your body because of the uranium that you have, that you've eaten or breathed, and it's inside your body now. 30 million beta particles go off every day from the potassium-40 in your body. And about 50 million decays a day from carbon-14. We have millions and millions of radioactive events happening in your cells, in your body every day. And obviously we have evolved a way to deal with that. So again, I guess the point I'd like to make here is that we're radioactive organisms. We eat the stuff. We're full of it. And basically, our cells are dealing with it because if they weren't dealing with it, we wouldn't be here. So we have mechanisms we've evolved to handle both the cosmic radiation, the natural background radiation. And there'll be arguments from people that will say, well, all these things all add up and we could be overloading the system. I just want to show you what some of the things we know about. And keep in mind that if you're talking 100 times more than what we're getting from natural stuff happens in other places in the world and they do not have health effects from it, we can kind of reassure ourselves that maybe that the stuff we're getting is not that too much to worry about. Okay, I just want to talk about this just because I like putting this up and I like her t-shirt. It says, if it wasn't for carbon-14, I wouldn't date at all. So she's got obviously issues with males and she doesn't want to date. And this may have to do with lifestyle of aircrew and pilots later, but we won't get into that. We'll talk about that in terms of risk in a minute. But this is an example of when you're eating food that contains carbon, we eat lots of fiber, it contains carbon. It has both ratios of normal carbon or stable carbon and radioactive carbon. As long as we're eating, it stays in equilibrium. We have the same ratio of radioactive carbon to normal carbon. If you might remember from the slide before, I said about 15 million electrons or beta particles come off of carbon-14 a day in our body because we're eating this radioactive food. Well, if we stop eating, i.e. we die, then that assimilation of the carbon-14 and carbon-12 stops. So we're not eating anymore. So now we have two isotopes in a ratio that's like this. And the carbon-14 starts going away with time, but the carbon-12 stays the same. And the longer we wait, the less and less and less carbon-14 because we're not continuously replenishing it by eating. And that's how we date things. The further away from the ratio we started with we are with time, the older the fossil is. And that's what carbon dating is called. So, also let's talk about potassium-40. You have potassium-40 in your body. It basically gives off radiation, beta particles and some gamma rays. This stuff, if you sleep with someone for a whole year next to them every night, not for a whole year, but every night, then they get exposed to radiation from you and you get exposed to radiation from them, from the potassium 40 component, which adds up over the year to about 0.02 millisieverts a year, or 20 microsieverts of radiation by sleeping with someone, which is equivalent to a hand X-ray. So you don't, and these are delivered at 2 different dose rates, right? This is over a year and this is all at once, but still the total dose to the organism is the same, whether you sleep with someone or get a hand X-ray. All right, so let's talk about some other occupational exposures. I put this in here because I'm standing here holding a fuel bundle that's about to go into a CANDU reactor. Okay, so that's a fully loaded uranium fuel bundle. These are fuel handling units. These are guys, this is the face of the reactor. That's going in the reactor. Holding that fuel bundle like up against my chest is going to give me about 40 microsieverts per hour. But if I hold it in front of me at 1 meter, it's shielded, the atmosphere is shielding me from the radioactivity that's coming off the uranium. And I get about 4 microsieverts per hour holding that thing at a meter. Like I can't hold it there for an hour because it's about 70 pounds or 65 pounds. So, but anyways, it's there and these things are doing the same thing.
But these are micro, not milli.
These are microsieverts, that's right. So what does that mean in terms of what you guys get, pilots and aircrew? Well, that was in that brochure. Here's what you get at the high end in the 777 series, highest dose rates. Microsieverts per hour, 7, 6, 7. That's actually more than holding the fuel bundle, right, per hour. But on the low end, it's there. So again, you have these calculations based on modeling that can give you different sort of calculations on dose, but somewhere between high of 7.5 down to a low of about 2.8 in this series of planes that however you guys operate these things. That dose rate per hour is the same as me holding a fuel bundle at 1 meter. Right there. So if you ask someone what's more dangerous in terms of radiation, they're going to say the fuel bundle, presumably, right? I would say. But in fact, that's what it's ironic that the dose rates are almost exactly per hour at 30,000 feet with a fuel bundle at 1 meter or sitting on the airplane. Just to put that in perspective for you. It doesn't mean that that's bad. It just means it's really low, both situations. Now this will give me a chance to segue into the medical exposures, which is 50% of our average exposure over our lifetimes as humans. The reason I say it that way is because if you have to go and get a couple of CT scans, all bets are off because you're not even on this chart anymore, right? You've given yourself radiation doses that are 10 times higher than what you get over your entire lifetime if you didn't have to get a medical procedure done. So, but we still say on average, we take the whole population, all the people, and say, you're getting exposed to natural stuff, and some people are getting exposed to medical stuff, but on average, this is the dose for the population size. This is what the dose rates are going to be. About 50%, you could say, comes from this source. So here it is again in a graphic form. I showed you this before. What makes up the big chunk of the half of the man-made stuff? There it is there. Nuclear medicine and X-rays. They make up a big chunk of it. The other man-made stuff, nuclear fuel cycle, fallout, occupational exposures like you would get flying an aircraft, are very small compared to when you put in the mixture of medical. This is just medical exposures. This is not therapy. This is not therapeutic doses. This is sort of diagnostic doses. X-rays, nuclear medicine, things like that.
Therapeutic doses are a lot higher.
Oh yeah, thousands of times higher. But we're trying to kill things there, tumors and stuff. So I'll start with my first little slide of my kids, and I'll talk about medical exposure. I'll start at the low end of medical exposures. This is what's called dual X-ray absorptometry. This is over here in the hospital at McMaster. This thing scans us, looks at our bones, and tells us how dense our bones are. It's bone mineral, bone density studies, and tells us how our bones are sort of mineralizing and demineralizing. And they don't have a lot of young children that are so-called normal, healthy. So whenever we get a chance to bring in normal, healthy kids, we do. These are my kids. Happened to be a snow day on February 6th, so they get to go to the hospital and volunteer to get irradiated, and they did. They were happy about that. You can tell they're smiling. Well, there's the dose from a banana. So that's 1 microsievert, right, roughly, from potassium 40 at these decays if you eat a banana. What did they get from the DEXA scan is, there's the DEXA scan, that's Roberta. And yeah, well, I'll do the math for you. So don't want to overtax you today, in this seminar. But that's roughly equivalent doses of radiation for the bone scan versus the eating the food that's radioactive. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that people would actually Some of them were very mortified by the fact that I took my kids to McMaster and irradiated them on their school day, but in effect we were getting some good information, and it worked out fine. X-rays. We go and get a chest X-ray. We get a whole body X-ray to our chest. We get about 1 millisievert, or 1 milligray. Because it's X-rays, I can call it a gray, because remember, sieverts and grays are the same when we're talking about X-rays or photons. This is a mammogram. So women go get annual mammograms. They will get about 1 millisievert or 1 milligray worth of dose. And this is, I have to put this up because when I say you get a chest X-ray, it's about 1. That ranges from about 0.01, depending upon the instrument you're using, up to 100, depending upon the procedure. Studies have been put out that show, depending upon the procedure you're getting, the instrument that they're using, the image they want to create, you can get a large, many orders of magnitude difference in dose from the same thing. So just by saying an X-ray gives you about 1 milligray, I put that up there as a baseline, but it can go either side of that 10 times or 100 times. All right? It's hard to keep track of these doses, but I'm just putting it this way just to give you relative proportions that X-rays in general are relatively low, mammograms relatively low. A CT scan, CAT scan, which is a series of X-rays, multiple series of X-rays, will add up in dose because you're doing many slices through a person's body. This is a slice through the person's body, through the chest cavity here. You get the heart in the middle, the spinal column, the vertebrae, and then the lungs. We've got some issues here with the lung with no tissue there, emphysema. There's a tumor in this person's lung, and it's my favorite slide because it has the cause of the tumor probably in his pocket of his shirt. And it's a full pack too. So, anyways, it's regrettable, but that's what causes, smoking causes lung cancer in general in some people. Anyways, the dose from that adds up. So you get 10 to 40 millisieverts or milligray dose from that particular procedure. So if you go get one CAT scan is about 10 years of flying worth of radiation. If you get one. Most people don't get one. You get 3 on average because you go find something, you treat something, you have a look and see if it's there, and you go do some follow-up. So it then puts all this idea of what is risk, kind of blows it out of proportion a little bit. I don't know if you have to get regular X-rays as a pilot. I know when when we were uranium mining in Elliott Lake, you had to get regular chest X-rays every year, which I'm sure added up to the dose way more than the mining was. And of course, we have other procedures that are getting more complicated where we combine a CAT scan with a PET scan. Remember the first slide I showed you of the lung tumor was a PET scan. This is a PET scan here in color. It can add up to into even higher doses from these diagnostic imaging procedures. I can put this up. I found this picture a while back. It was published in a book in 1989. I can't find out when it was actually taken. It's hard to see, but it's airport security at French Customs. There's an open X-ray tube right here. This guy's holding a fluoroscopy screen looking through it. And there's a suitcase between the source and the screen. And they got a whole bunch of other stuff they're going to look at over here on its way to the States. I don't know what kind of dose they were getting there, but I can assure you it probably was a high dose if you're doing that every day.
It looks like the 1800s just from the...
It does.
Yeah.
But it can't be too 1800 because we didn't actually invent X-rays until 1895. So probably early 1900s. But these guys, this is the time when we didn't really understand how these things worked, and lots of people had lots of tissue damaged and things happened in those days. But I thought I'd bring up body scanners because that's a big thing, right? We have to worry about, when you go through the scanners, there's the 2 types of scanners. You've probably heard about them. One uses microwaves, which can look through your clothes, do a surface analysis, or low energy X-rays. The low energy X-rays can penetrate this stuff and you get your image produced, so we can see things hidden under clothes like that, which would be very bad for her to be carrying that gun like that and things. But if you want to talk about doses, if you're going flying and you're going through this thing, or you're air crew and you're going to go through one of these scanners, I don't know if you have to or not, but I do usually. I usually pick it. If I have a choice, I'll say I'll take the scanner, just go in there and get some X-rays. How much dose do you actually get? People are worried about it. Delivers about that a single scan, which is tiny, and it's about 2 minutes of flying at 30,000 feet, or less, maybe a minute, depending on where you're flying.
There's been a question about whether or not, because that amount of in that case, microsieverts is over such a small dermal depth, that in fact it considered a more of a problem? Is that accurate or not?
That would be a good hypothesis, but there's no data to support that at all.
Like none.
Especially at those doses, because you have to understand that that's like saying on I can't even do the math, but it's about 1 cell in every 10,000 are actually going to get a photon hitting it.
Right. Yeah.
At 1 millisievert, so 1 millisievert, this is microsieverts, every cell on your surface of your body might get 1 photon.
Right.
So it's not even, like, it's such a tiny amount. Some people are arguing that maybe because the lens of your eye is particularly sensitive, that you might want to close your eyes. But you're going to close your eyes for the whole freaking flight across? So you got a problem there. All right, so let's look at some, okay, we'll look at some epidemiology, just sort of a high-level look at what we kind of know as of today. And we'll just start off with this first one. So I'm going to go back. This guy, John Boyce, is a well-known, very reputable epidemiologist. And he put this out in 2000 in a journal called Health Physics. And they looked at epidemiological studies in pilots and aircrew. And I put this on there so you'll have a reference to it and you can read it. But the bottom line is this. Back in 2000, epidemiological studies conducted over the last 20 years provide little consistent evidence linking cancer with radiation exposure from air travel. So basically what he's saying there is we don't have any evidence epidemiologically 10 years ago that the past 20 years have caused any increase. We have sort of no evidence to suggest that there's some negative effects from radiation. He points out specifically from radiation exposure. Another one more recently, 2008, put out in London, Cosmic Radiation in Commercial Aviation. Epidemiological studies of flight crew have not shown conclusive evidence for any increase in cancer mortality or cancer incidence directly attributable to ionizing radiation exposure. Again, no increased cancer risk from ionizing radiation. Another study put out more recently, 2009, ionizing radiation is considered to contribute little, if at all, to elevated risk for cancer among aircrew, whereas excess ultraviolet radiation is a probable cause for increased melanoma. So there is increased risk, but the last sort of the sort of major epidemiological reviews looking at cancer risk associated with radiation exposure have not shown anything. But the question is there increased risk for others? Is there an increased cancer risk or other type of risk in pilots and in aircrew? And this is the first sort of mention of increased melanoma risk. Well, it's been established that there is increased melanoma risk in aircrew and in pilots, probably because of ultraviolet radiation, because there is known to be an increased melanoma risk for aircrew and pilots.
Does the aircraft structure not shield you from ultraviolet?
It has to do with what you do in your leisure time.
Okay.
That's what they claim.
Right.
I'll go back to the study back in 2000, so I'll go up one sentence. For example, there is an increased risks of certain types of cancer in aircrew and in pilots. And so, for example, increased rates of breast cancer among flight attendants has been attributed to reproductive factors such as nulliparty, which means they don't have as many children on average as other women do. So having babies is well known to actually reduce your risk of getting breast cancer. But if you don't have babies, your risk goes up. So there is an increased risk associated with breast cancer, and they're attributing it to the fact of the lifestyle of the aircrew and the attendants increases their risk. It's not much. It's a tiny, tiny increase in risk. But if you can show an increase in risk due to an occupational sort of, I wouldn't even say it's occupational, it's probably more behavior associated with the occupation you have, you're going to increase your risk one way or the other. So you can actually go on and figure out that these things actually increase your risk. And then the other thing is, and increased rates of melanoma among pilots have been attributed to excessive sun exposure during leisure time activities. So you have increased cancer risk. And so the first thing we do is cause and effect, right? We have a cause, we have an effect, which is cancer, increased breast cancer in attendants and increased melanoma in pilots. Well, what's the effect? Well, there's radiation from flying, so it must be radiation. But in fact, you can do some nice epidemiological studies that shows it's not the radiation, it's something else that's causing the increased risk. Just a couple of papers just came out, ultraviolet light and blue light. This is for civilian pilots. There is an increased risk of cataracts and stuff caused by not wearing sunglasses. And then this one here is talking about one of the biggest risks we have in terms of cancer. We know that perturbations to your circadian rhythms or your diurnal cycles, in other words, sleeping when you're supposed to sleep and being awake when you're supposed to be awake, is a good thing. If you screw that up a lot, if you actually do a lot of night shifts, if you work shift work, if you do long sort of periods where you don't sleep and then long periods where you do sleep, that changes your circadian rhythm. That definitely has effect on risk associated with certain diseases. So they're talking about that now as being one of the risk factors. I'm not saying this is a negotiating thing you can deal with when it comes to negotiating, but it is a lifestyle. And I just pulled up one sort of slide where this was a thesis someone did, and they just, you didn't really need to look at this, but it was just challenges facing airline pilots. And I just went through the whole things that you guys have to go through as pilots, and it causes physiological and psychological stress, a lot of these things. So these things will also play a role in terms of your risk of getting diseases, in terms of occupational, your occupation, but it's not related to the one component we all think about, the radiation in flying. All right, I'm going to just talk to you about how do we actually try and calculate your risk. This should take a few minutes. Is that clock still working?
Yeah, I can hear it ticking.
Is that the right time?
It is.
All right. I had to wind that up at the start, so it's it's not. I got that off. I'll talk about that in a minute. All right. So the way that we have to talk about risk and the way that risk is calculated is based on a hypothesis that's been used for many, many years, and is still being used today in many situations, although it's being challenged from many different directions. And that's called the LNT hypothesis, which means linear no threshold hypothesis. And this hypothesis is a very simplistic way of looking at how radiation works with us. It's a model, it's a hypothesis that says that dose is additive. Well, okay, so we can add up dose. We can add 10 plus 10 is 20, and 20 plus 20 is 40, and we can add up the dose, and the dose is additive. It also says that the risk associated with the dose is additive. So if a small dose of 10 has this risk, if we double that dose, we can add that up. We can also double the risk associated with it. So dose is additive, risk is additive. There is no threshold for risk. That is, no matter what dose of radiation you get exposed to, it carries with it some level of risk. There is no threshold. The threshold means below a certain point, there is no effect. I'm just telling you what the model is suggesting. And it says we're all the same with respect to risk. So biological factors, environmental and biological and genetic factors do not play a role in the risk. It's just the dose of radiation that matters in this model for predicting your risk. So that's basically the biggest studies that have been done to use that model to try and predict risk that we might get exposed to is called the lifetime studies of the atomic bomb survivors. This is in Hiroshima, Japan. This is a group of students we took from McMaster to Hiroshima as part of a course. We've been trying to run this course every couple of years at McMaster and take students there. This is the A-bomb dome, the last standing building they had. They left it there to remind everybody of it. And they have a big park and a museum, and they have a moratorium there, and they have a whole bunch of historical museums of things that went on. But they also have there what we call the Radiation Effects Research Foundation, RERF. And RERF was established very early after the atomic bomb was dropped to study the impacts of the atomic weapon on human health. And it's been going on ever since. It basically has been looking at all the survivors of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima, studying their health, looking at different diseases, and trying to predict from that exposure what our risk today might be from the exposures we get exposed to from occupational and medical exposures. So that's a group of students. We go there, we look at this stuff, and we work it out. Again, it is in Japan, and it started many years ago. About half the survivors are still alive that survived the atomic bomb. So we have still a large cohort of people that need to be studied. And the way this model works, this linear no threshold model, is we have our doses of radiation along the x-axis, and we have increased cancer risk along the y-axis. And if we actually take the data and look at the risk of different types of cancers in these people, and ask what was the risk of getting cancer if you're exposed to these doses of radiation, we can see that somewhere around an acute exposure of 100 millisieverts, all at once, whole body, increased cancer risk slightly in the population. And with increasing dose, up to about 4,000 millisieverts, we had a linear response for cancer risk. Now, it's not exactly the end of the points scatter a bit, but you can draw a line through them and say, from somewhere between 100 up to 1,000, there is a linear increase in risk. And at some point above 1,000, it drops off because obviously people did not survive that dose to actually live to get cancer. And the way it works is then you just take that line and you use that line and draw it down to background and say that is the line that we're going to use to extrapolate your risk as an individual. You're going to guess it based on the dose you get. So here's the log scale. So this is 10. So 1's about here. So you'd say, well, if you get exposed to 1 millisievert or 2 a year being a pilot, then your risk would probably be about this, based on the scale. Okay? So that's how they do it.
Is it a linear scale on?
Yeah. So if you're looking at, but if you look at the actual overall risk of getting cancer and things like that, you can see that some of the data doesn't fit this model. There are models that show that it goes like that. There's some kind of curvilinear line to it. There could be superlinear and some different endpoints we look at that may go like this down to here. And then there's some data, there's a substantial amount of data that says that if we get below a certain dose, we can get a negative risk effect. And that means that the effect is not there. Somewhere in the range of around 10 millisievert dose. This is acute exposures. You get some kind of negative effect. So actually, no risk at all associated with it. And
sorry, Doc, is this like single dose acute?
Single acute, yeah.
Okay.
I'll show you some scientific data that supports it. So we have some data, we have a model. Some of the data isn't fitting the model, which is where the controversy is coming in, which is where there's a heated debate between scientists and among scientists about whether or not we should use this model to predict risk. I don't think there's a doubt that we shouldn't use it for radiation protection purposes. In other words, this is just saying, assume it's all bad, keep the dose as low as reasonably possible, we'll be safe. It's a precautionary principle, and so it's used extensively in radiation protection. But from a point of view of me trying to calculate what your risk is or assess what your risk is being exposed to an X-ray from a chest X-ray or from being exposed to a bit of radiation flying, it's a very risky business, no pun intended. It's very difficult to make any kind of scientific extrapolation using this model, especially since there's a lot of data that doesn't support the model and tells us we should reject the model. That's how we do it in science. We never really can prove anything to 100% certainty. We can only say that the model is not supported by the data to a level of confidence of 95% or 99%. And right now, the data is not supporting that linear extrapolation. In fact, below 100 millisievert, there is no scientific data that says there is risk of being exposed to radiation. So below 100, total acute dose, we do not see cancer risk from radiation. It's all extrapolated, modeled.
And how does acute dose compare with, say, annual doses? Because we've been talking annual doses up until now.
So acute doses, if you actually look at the biology, they should be orders of magnitude, they'll have a larger biological effect than annual doses. That's called dose protractionation, right? So you protractionate the dose, lower dose rate. In effect, it's called a dose rate modifying factor. So you lower the dose rate, the biological effect is less. There's some debate on what it should be. Should it be, twice as safe, 3 times as safe, 5 times as safe? And this, again, is based on a linear no threshold model, some of this protracted dose stuff. But if you actually look at the data, you can see that if you protractionate to a certain point where you're at background, you can't actually see it. It's just, you're getting, the fact of the matter is that this is a type of carcinogen, if you want to call it a carcinogen at high doses that we're talking about. It has, the problem with it is there's a background component to it. It's not like we're being exposed to it as a unique thing. We're getting exposed to it all the time, and now we're asking, what is the effect of a little bit more of it? And that's where the problem comes in.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yep, no problem.
What kind of radiation are we talking about? Obviously, this is just an overall.
So it depends. Like I got to normalize the sieverts here.
Right.
If you want to talk about this particular data for the gold standard for A-bomb survivors, you're talking largely gamma radiation and neutrons. Okay. And the 2 bombs had different components of gamma radiation and neutrons, because one was made of plutonium, one was made of uranium. So they had different ratios of gamma versus neutrons. But if you add that together, you're looking at, this is the acute effect of combined mixed field radiation. Not just gamma, not just neutrons, but mix them both together and then blast every cell in your body with them all at once. Right. This dose here, this at 1,000, this dose here says that every cell in your body in an instant gets roughly 1,000 tracks of radiation through it, through its cell, through the DNA, all at once, 1,000 tracks. At a milligray, which is down here, you only get 1 per cell. So there's big differences in how cells can handle things when it's like overloading systems and managing things at high doses and low doses. So if we look at individual risk, these numbers keep changing, they keep going up, but today it seems, I think the last number I heard was that there's about a 42% chance of people getting cancer now in North America. That's going up for a number of reasons. There is not, as far as we know, an epidemic of cancer. The fact of the matter is that people are living longer. The longer you live, the higher numbers, higher probability that you have of getting cancer. happens, right?
That's total lifetime risk.
Total lifetime risk right now. And if you look at the Canadian Cancer Institute website, that's the number they use. I think 42 is the number I've seen.
And that's not deaths from cancer, that's incidence of cancer.
Incidence of cancer,
Some of that will
yeah.
be cured.
Some of that we cured. That number varies about the cancer because cancer is a complicated disease. Many different types of cancers, different types of disease. Cure rates are different. You know, prostate has a very high success rate. Pancreatic cancer doesn't. Breast cancer has high. Ovarian doesn't. So you put everything into the pot again. That's your chance to get in. I think this point I'm going to make is that number probably doesn't mean too much. Well, it does. If the fact of the matter is we're living longer, the chances of getting cancer the longer we live goes up.
Like to say, if you're a guy with cancer, it means a lot.
It means a lot, yeah. In fact, it does. But I guess from a statistical point of view, it applies to these people. And these are my people I get off the internet. They're the average faces of a male and a female. There's about 1,000 faces averaged together there. So it's an average person. Never born, will never die. But that's sort of the risk of them getting cancer. Some people argue that there's a 0% chance of getting cancer or a 100% chance based on your genetics and based on your environment. So, but on average, these numbers apply. So that's where the LNT model comes in, right? It doesn't take into account anything, just radiation dose. That's all. So it's this and numbers like average numbers. These people, if they get exposed to 1,000 millisieverts, we know from the A-bomb data survivor, atomic bomb survivor data, that their risk goes up 5%. These average people, they get exposed to 1,000 millisieverts based on the A-bomb survivors, the risk goes up 5%. What does that mean? That means one person in 20 that gets exposed to this big dose of radiation may develop another cancer. It's already a risk of 40%. The other thing I like to point out is we always like to talk about the 1 in 20. It means that if you get exposed to 1,000 millisieverts, that's way more than we get occupationally, that 19 out of 20 people won't get cancer. So look at the other side. 19 out of 20 won't. All right, so let's talk about maybe some occupation exposures. The model simply just does the calculation. It says 0.05% at 10 millisieverts. And if you went to 1, it'd be 0.005%, right? It's a linear calculation. That means that 1 in 2,000 people that get exposed to 10 millisieverts, which is roughly a CT scan, might get a cancer, or 40% to 0.04. So this is how the model does the calculations. And when you start thinking about it, it's kind of hard to understand how this might make any sense, to me anyways, from a biological point of view. Nonetheless, that's the risk we say. But again, a single CT scans means 1,999 people will not get cancer from it. That's the other side, the other way of looking at it. But if you're the one person, that's what everyone worries about. So we're, again now, and here's the other problem we have with this model is that it's based largely on atomic bomb survivor data. Atomic bomb survivors survived in 1945 in Japan. They're from Japan, so they had a different genetic background, different ethnic background. They lived in a different place. Their environment was different. They had different food. Even compared to today, things were way different back then in 1945 in Japan. You can imagine during a war about nutrition and medical care and health care and stuff like that. But let's just look today at what our average risks are between two genetically distinct populations, North American females, Asian females, and two environmentally different populations, North America and Asia. So different genetic background, different environment. If you just look at the cancer risks today of the two most prevalent ones, or two prevalent ones, you have that. We know breast cancer in North American females is relatively high, and we know that stomach cancer is very low. And it's the opposite, actually, in Japan. So the question is, well, they're different genetically and they're different environmentally, what is the impact? Well, we know for certain that both play a big role in this. But one of the experiments you can do is just have a look at what happens when people from North America live in Asia, and when Asian ethnic background people live in North America, and ask what happens to those two cancer risks, right? And that experiment, you can just do this, and you see what happens is the cancer's sort of, the probability of getting it changes. So we haven't done anything here. We haven't changed radiation exposure. We haven't done anything different other than just have them live in a different place, eat different food, breathe different air, whatever it takes. But it changes cancer risk. So we know that there's these big genetic and environmental impacts on just the general risk in the population alone of cancer. And then we try and take the LNT model and say, well, does radiation, can we say that a little bit of radiation will have a bigger impact than these things here? And I think we're learning that because of all the data that's coming out today, then in fact it's going to be very difficult to actually be able to predict risk based on a model that is very simple and linear. So I'll talk real quick about this. We know that high doses are bad for you. You get too much of anything, including radiation, is going to cause genetic effects. And classic examples we have is we treated children that had this fungus on their head that they called ringworm with big doses of radiation to the head, and they subsequently developed brain tumors, which is unfortunate. We also know that women that painted the radium dials on clocks and aircraft instrumentation for the Second World War ingested a lot of this stuff because of the practice of putting the paintbrush into the radium paint, painting the number, and then dipping it in their mouth. And painting the numbers, dipping it in their mouth, making the tip sharp so they could paint these numbers on, and people started getting bone cancer because radium acts like calcium in our body, goes to our bones, causes bone cancer. So right away, this is sort of the first example, in my opinion, where health physics radiation protection worked. They went in and said, stop putting the paintbrush in your mouth, and cancer stopped. It wasn't external, it was all internal stuff. So it's a good example of how if you tell people to stop doing things, and this is a clock I got off the internet for 15 bucks. You can still buy them. This is a radium dial clock. It glows in the dark. It has radium on it. It'll glow in the dark for as long as I have it. And I'll just show you. It's so you can see the radiation coming off of it. They painted a lot of the aircraft instrumentation in the Second World War with this stuff, and they say that there's some runways in Britain where the people that were training ended up going off the end of the runway and plummeting into the water. There's a lot of this stuff at the bottom of the ocean down there, so it's a bit contaminated. One thing else I didn't show you while I got a chance here is there's some other natural stuff, like I was talking about natural radiation, and this is a plate that has uranium oxide coating on it. The uranium actually gives it this nice orange color when you put it into a ceramic. It's called Fiesta ware. I have a large collection of it now because when I see it, I buy it. It's fairly cheap. But you need a Geiger counter with it if you're going into the antique store, which scared everybody.
So what about the dial on the watch?
On which watch?
This one.
Is that a tritium?
It does glow.
Oh, that's a different thing. Yeah, that's a different thing. Yeah. You're using a different, but there are tritium dial watches which are radioactive. So this is the plate, and it's got a lot more than that uranium rock I had. So you can see it's got stuff in it. This is thorium, which makes glass a nice green color, right? And you can see that, that plate away here. There. So you can see it, you can pick it up, it's a lot lower level. These mantles from Coleman lanterns have thorium in it. It gives a really nice white glow, right? So when you put it in your mantle, and you can see it's got a bit in it. So. And then the last thing I have is a little chip out of a smoke detector, which is americium-241. That's in your smoke detector. And that's got a lot of radioactivity coming off it too. So there's all these things we have in our house. Well, we don't have a lot of these anymore, but we've used these things before in the past, just using natural radioactivity for our benefit for certain things. I don't know if you think an orange plate is beneficial, but it's pretty color to me. All right, so these radium dial painters, they painted those things. They got increased cancer risk. This is sort of just a picture of them painting. There's all big factories of these ladies painting these dials for aircraft in the war and stuff. If you look at the dose to their skeleton, they're huge doses. See how big they were? This is dose of skeleton. This is the percent of people with cancers, and you can see that at a certain dose, which is still fairly high, there are no cancers. So this is an example where there's a threshold for getting cancer, even at these high doses. So no one's arguing that high doses don't cause cancer. The argument comes in is, well, where does it stop causing cancer? Is there a threshold? And for this particular type of research, there seems to be that there is a threshold for this type of, these are alpha particles coming from radium that are in your bone. Let me talk about radon gas. If you Google radon gas, that's what you're going to get. Remember, radon's the gas that comes from radioactive decay. That's a picture of radon gas. That's a picture probably of me when I lived in Elliott Lake, because they told me my house was full of radon gas and I was going to die if I didn't stay out of the basement for more than 2 hours a week. It was going to be a big dose of radiation to me. So unfortunately, my bedroom was in the basement, so I get a bit of an issue with that. So probably that's why I'm standing up here today. A little bit of misinformation always inspires people to do things, and that definitely inspired me to figure out whether these guys knew what they're talking about. But there's still a debate whether or not radon gas causes cancer at high doses of it. I mean, high doses, it would seem, yes, there is an increase in cancer incidence, but what about at low doses? Even the high dose stuff is controversial. But at low doses, what about low doses? Well, let's look at, there's one study that looked at low doses, this one here by Bernard Cohen. Still hasn't been challenged. I like showing it because it simply shows that when you look at lung cancer deaths per 10,000 people and correlate it to radon in non-smokers or in smokers, if you didn't have any radon gas at all, you'd expect there to be a flat line, right? If radon gas had no impact on lung cancer, you'd expect a straight line. If it was related, which it looks like it is here, as the radon in the low dose range concentrations go up, the probability of dying of lung cancer goes down. So it's an inverse relationship. So that's sort of saying at these low doses, having a negative risk, because it would be normally 7 under normal circumstances, but now we're dropping it half almost as we get up to these low levels of radon in your house. And then at some point, the authors argue that it's going to go up again, because we're getting to overload the system again, and it goes up, and then at some high dose you get it back up to where you were before, and then it's going to increase above that.
Sorry, just so I understand that. That's showing a decreased incidence of lung cancer deaths with increasing radon concentration.
At low doses, yeah. So this is picocuries per liter. As you go up to about 5 picocuries per liter, the risk of dying of lung cancer is a lot less. This is in 1,600 different counties.
Does that relate at all to working
This is just in houses, in your basements houses. People exposed to natural radon stuff.
So the increase is, they're not showing any actual increase.
No, there's a break in that data, which is why they're predicting, because they know in the higher doses, way out, when you go way out,
okay,
when you're uranium miners,
okay,
that there
so
could be increased risk. Somewhere it's going to get back up. This is just the real data. This is about as far as they get in some of their collecting of their data in the houses. And this is, as far as I know, it still has not been related to anything else other than radon. There's about 2,000 different confounding factors you can look at here, but radon seems to be the direct correlate of risk of dying of lung cancer. And the biggest thing is, I think, when you're a smoker, your risk goes up, but this impact is even greater in smokers. Less lung cancer risk in smokers if radon gas is higher. And of course, people want to take advantage of these things, so you buy an old uranium mine in Montana, you charge people to go in it. I think they charge about $100 to go in once a day for 2 hours, sit there and breathe radon gas for an hour a day. And it works. Well, there's all sorts of mines, like there's this place in Europe, they 10 treatments every other day. They are at 4,500 picocuries per liter. Remember the other graph showed only up to 5? So they're pushing it here.
Okay.
But these people believe, and there is evidence to suggest that these people are not being harmed by it. So people are using this as a therapeutic thing. We've been doing this for years. All right, I'm going to go back into find out the mechanisms of what we're doing here, because I got to wrap this up soon. At McMaster, we're approaching this in sort of 3 different ways. We're trying to understand what the risk is when you are exposed to the low doses, not the high doses and extrapolate down. We're also trying to figure out what the relative role of your genetics and environment are, and we're also looking at ways of detecting whether or not people have been overexposed to big doses using tools that we're developing here at MAC. So in other words, when Fukushima happened, we got a phone call from Health Canada saying, how many samples could you process at McMaster University if we were to get hundreds or thousands of samples from Japan, from people in Japan that were possibly overexposed. And our number here is we could probably process about 600 blood samples a month if we ramped it right up to look for changes in chromosomes that would give us a correlation to if you were exposed to external radiation. So we're developing these kind of things. We never got any samples from Japan because no one actually got a big enough dose for me to detect, even though we were told a lot of people were getting it. No one ever got a dose higher than, as far as I believe, somewhere around 150 millisieverts over the 5 days or 6 days. And they're allowed during emergency situations to get somewhere around 200 to 250 millisieverts to do emergency operations. So no one even got that, so that was a good thing. Although people were told that this was going to be a big thing, it never ended up. It was handled in a way that people weren't overexposed. Because you can easily detect the stuff, you can measure it, you can monitor how much you're going to get, and then you can get out when you've had enough. All right, so just basically the types of radiation we're exposed to. The radiation itself, you know, when I'm talking about alpha particles and beta particles and gamma rays, these are energetic photons or particles that have virtually the same sort of impact when they hit things. They create free radicals. They ionize our molecules to different extents based on the physical characteristics of them. But the bottom line is, depending on where they come from, that just basically tells you what type of particle they are. Alpha particles are simply helium atoms, beta particles are electrons, and they come flying out of unstable atoms and interact with us. This is just showing you an example of an alpha particle. If you look at an alpha particle in what we call a cloud chamber, you can actually see the track of radiation moving through, and it creates these ionization as it goes. So it's a very dense track along its main path, but you see all these little spurs coming off these other little tracks, and that's just scattering radiation. So that's what your cell's going to see as an alpha particle goes through it. And so this is just a cartoon showing you that all these things, these little dots, represent an atom being ionized as this particle goes through our cell and our DNA. And if it interacts with our DNA, this is a model of a double-stranded DNA helix. You can get an ionization on a base. You can ionize the backbone of the sugars that cause damage to DNA. Or if you have a highly charged alpha particle, it does base damage and both strands get broken, called the double strand break, which is why these higher energetic particles like alpha particles will cause more damage to DNA per unit dose delivered to the cell. That's why they become more biologically damaging when they have higher energy deposition per unit track length. But at some point, if we look at what happens, again, this is a DNA strand. This is what we call relative biological effectiveness. As the energy that's transferred as the particle moves along that track goes up, so as LET goes up, the RBE goes up, until it peaks at 100 kiloelectron volts per micrometer, then it drops off again. And the reason for that being is that the double strand break in DNA is the critical thing that causes issues with us when we get too many of them. And so at this energy level, that's roughly where you get an ionization occurring at the same distance that your DNA is, which is roughly 20 angstroms. So it has the maximum biological effectiveness. After that point, the RBE starts going down based on the energy absorbed, because you can't get more than one double strand break. You're just wasting energy. See what I'm saying? So that's why when we talk about alpha particles and other things, they will cause double strand breaks, but there'll be a lot of ionizations there that won't have an impact because they're basically just gone through the cell. It's a waste of energy. It's not causing a double strand break. So when you're thinking about the particles you might encounter while flying, the alpha particles, protons, they have this higher LET that basically is going to start dropping off as you get, the effect will start dropping off as you get higher and higher energy of them. So it's just a way of saying it's not all bad. As the energy gets higher, it's not all bad from a DNA perspective. All right, I'm going to bypass this because we're running out of time. This is my little model of what happens to cells when they get hit by radiation. So if you start with a normal cell, and pretend this is the nucleus of a cell where all the DNA is, where all those strand breaks are going to happen, and you run a photon or alpha particle through it, it's going to cause damage to the brain of the cell, the nucleus. And three things can happen. One is the cell itself will be able to repair itself to normal, which means the consequence of the photon going through the cell is not there. It's repair back to normal, no consequence. On the other hand, this could kill the cell. The cell dies. Well, there's a consequence to the cell, but there's no consequence to the organism, because dead cells can never become cancer cells. So dying, a single cell dying is a good thing, and single cells repairing themselves back to normal is a good thing after being interacted with radiation. The problem we get into is this, is when you get an abnormal cell, and that is, I've had this sort of personality changing of the cell where it actually doesn't do what it's supposed to do anymore, it misbehaves, and that cell can then become a rogue cancer cell and cause problems in your body. But the real model is this. That's a little simple model. This is what we kind of use for the three pathway model. Damage this DNA of the cell, which is the brain of the cell, repair yourself to normal, or kill yourself, commit suicide. These two pathways are genetically controlled, modified environmentally, but work very hard to stop the cell from going down this pathway. And it's when you get genetic defects in either one of these pathways, or environmental stresses or influences that change the way those pathways work, is when you can drive it down this pathway. The point I want to make here in this slide is that radiation only starts at this point. There's many steps that go from here down to here before you get here that the LNT model does not take into account, and that we're learning the impact of these pathways has on all the risks of going down these different things. This is just a blood sample I take from a human. There's about 40 dots here. I don't know if you can see them. There's red dots. There's 4 yellow dots. these 4 cells have committed suicide after I irradiated this population of cells, so I can count them. They're very elegant tools to tell which cells are committing suicide. I call it committing suicide because it's called programmed cell death, or apoptosis. It means the cell has made a genetic decision to eliminate itself from the population. It's not just falling apart. And the DNA repair processes, we know there's some 300 or 400 genes that control that pathway. A single defect in one of those genes in that pathway can cause severe increase in cancer risk going down this pathway. So a couple of experiments I'll show you about and then we'll be finished. Well, cells have to go, like I said, once they get initially damaged by something like radiation. If there's too much of it there, you get this damage will actually persist enough that the cell says, okay, I've got some genetic damage here that's going to cause a change in the way I do things. You have to be able to measure that using different things. And when a cell changes, we call it the cell is being transformed into from a normal cell to a cancer cell. So the assay is called the transformation assay. And this transformation assay is an example here of some cells in a flask. Some of these cells, when I put 10,000 cells into a flask like this, some of these cells will turn into cancer cells, depending on what I do with them. They transform. So instead of doing what they're supposed to do in this flask, they will actually invade the flask and take over like a tumor would in your body. Start growing out of control, growing fast, and invade. And this is kind of an example of one here. So we put 10,000 cells in the flask, we wait 6 weeks, we feed them, we look after them in incubators, and we ask how many cells in the flask turn into these transformants, or precancerous cells. And they kind of look like this. You can see this one here up close. It's a lot of cells piling up on top of each other and invading out into the flask, so taking over the flask. And that's what tumors are. They pile up, they have out of control growth, and the key thing about them is they invade, and they interfere with other organs and other tissues. So we call that type 3 foci. If we take the cells from this and inject it into a mouse, we know they cause cancer because they will kill a mouse. It will cause tumors in them and kill a mouse. So we just count the number of these foci we get in a flask, depending upon the treatment, and ask, what was the risk of transforming cells in the flask? It's a very simple model system we use. Well, if we do nothing, and I'm using milligray here, just think millisievert, 1 millisievert, 10 millisievert, 100 millisieverts. If I do nothing, about 18 of these cells out of 10,000 will turn into spontaneous transformers. That's what we call the spontaneous rate of cancer. And if I expose the flask to 1 milligray, 10 milligray, or 100 milligray, the number of cells that transform actually drops. Does not go up in this low dose range. They don't get killed, they actually eliminate themselves. So what it's saying is, at these dose ranges where these are single acute doses, either 1, 10, or 100, it actually reduces it roughly to the same extent. So it's like an on-off switch. It's not proportional to the amount that you give it. Give this little dose, you actually reduce the transformation frequency. That's been known for many years now, and a lot of other studies have reproduced that in different model systems showing that these low doses of radiation somehow have an anti-transformation or anti-carcinogenic process involved with them. There's a study done in California, same idea, different scale. I should change that, but if you do nothing, the number of transformers is about 3 per 10 to the 5, and these low doses actually drop it, and as you get higher doses, it starts going up again. It's a classic sort of curve I was telling you about, the U-shaped curve that decreases risk at the lower end and increases at the higher end. We've shown this in mice for cancer risk, where we've looked at mice that we've given a big dose of radiation to, so 1 Gray or 1 sievert all at once. These yellow dots represent the mice that die of leukemia with time, so they're almost all dead by 600 days. This other group of mice got exposed to 100 milligray or 100 millisieverts 24 hours before getting the leukemia-inducing dose, which is this one. And they lived about half the time of normal mice. So they extended their life by half, which again is a positive effect in the sense that these mice lived significantly longer by getting a little more radiation. It just happened to be a low dose before the big cancer-inducing dose. So again, some more evidence suggesting that maybe these low doses aren't causing a negative effect and perhaps are modulating the biological processes that are involved in risk. I thought I'd put this one up for breast cancer because that's one of the risks associated with being a flight attendant. Not from radiation, but from whatever else caused it, mostly not having children, I think. It's a small risk, like I said before, but if you actually look at radiation and breast cancer risk, in people that were given fluoroscopy treatments in history, you can see that this is centigrade, so add a 0 and you'll get milligray, 50, 100, 200, 500. These were given in multiple series, so not all at once. So doses were given every couple of weeks to follow tuberculosis management in these patients and women in Ontario and Canada. And it shows, again, that this is what it is if they didn't get any radiation. And as the radiation dose goes up, we have that drop at the low end, and then again, it gets higher again. So again, a non-linear response with some kind of threshold. And I think that's about all I want to say with respect to that, except a paper just came out, well, last year now, almost a year and a half ago, where they're asking about babies being exposed to radiation. So there's, again, this issue about pregnant women flying or pregnant aircrew flying, getting exposed to cosmic radiation, women that may be pregnant working in the nuclear industry. Is there an increased risk to them? Well, using the precautionary principle and the ALARA principle, we say yes, there could be an increased risk because you have a developing fetus. There's many rapidly dividing cells there. There's a chance that if we expose those rapidly dividing cells to a carcinogen, it could transpire into a carcinoma someday down the road. There's some evidence to support it. It's not very strong. In fact, there's some evidence that says that that's not the case at all. But to be safe and to be cautionary, we just say, okay, let's reduce the risk as below as reasonably achievable and not expose so-called pregnant women that are, especially fetuses in the first trimester of development, to any excessive radiation that they don't need. But there are situations where women that are pregnant have to get irradiated diagnostically because of medical problems. They could have serious life-threatening problems where they need to get exposed to radiation. And the idea is that the study was done looking at live births in women that were exposed to radiation during their pregnancy and that weren't. And there's all sorts of different doses and dose ranges, all very low doses, but it had to be done. And they looked at 1.8 million live births in Ontario over from 1992 to 2008 and looked at the cancer risk in the offspring that were born to women that were irradiated during their pregnancy and women that weren't. And it was a very nice study that showed that, in fact, you probably don't have to worry too much if you have to get one of these life-saving medical procedures, because it looks like the risk of getting cancers is very low already in the first place. So in the general population, it's about 1.56 cancers per 10,000 live births of the unexposed group. And in the exposed group, there was 1.13 cancers per 10,000 live births. The authors of this study were basically saying this is something that we need to educate people on more, because the fact of the matter is there is not increased cancer risk in their offspring if they have to get a diagnostic procedure. So you can tell them with some certainty, especially with that number of live births, 1.8 million, that the effect on your fetus is not going to be there. So that's a good thing. Now, whether that number is different, the authors did not even mention or argue whether or not that number is lower than the normal population, but it's lower. It looks lower. It's not significant, I don't think, but they never did I didn't see the stats on it. So,
sorry, Dennis, just going to interrupt.
Yep.
You. What was the exposure rate for?
Oh, it could be, they had a whole series of,
Just an entire
whether, you know, it could be a deep vein thrombosis. A mother's pregnant, she's got to go in, she's going to get scatter radiation when she gets a leg X-ray. Maybe something with the lungs where you got to get a CT scan because part of your heart's having a problem. All the exposures were put into any women that had to go into some kind of diagnostic medical procedure. Doses weren't necessarily calculated precisely, just basically whether you were exposed or not.
Because it's funny, because I know that Labour Canada, in fact, used part of this study as a reason to lower the your millisieverts allowable for pregnant workers. So
yeah, well, that's, and I know right now they're trying to come up with dose limits for medical procedures, which is going to cause a big controversy, I think. Yeah. I mean, if I get 4 chest X-rays this year, and that gives me my annual dose of whatever they're going to set it at, and I got to go and get something because I got a serious life-threatening problem, I'm not going to worry about the limit. Because that's the problem, is that sometimes we do get large doses of diagnostic stuff if we have a serious medical problem. Right. Usually the biggest doses are in people that are overweight and have heart problems. And they're going in to get these X-rays to find out, these fluoroscopies to see if their heart's working, cardiac scans. Well, you're hardly going to say to a person, well, your heart's going to, you know, it could fail on you any minute, but we have to have a look and see. But your risk of getting cancer might be 0.04% over the next 30 years. The guy's going like, I'm not going to worry about that right now. You know, I think this is a fundamental flaw we have, is that we've made the, we jump too quick, we overreact, and that causes all the other stuff that goes with it. This has been known for years. Employees in the nuclear industry are less likely in the general population excuse me, to die from cancer and non-cancer diseases. Excuse me. And That could be said for, like there's lots of arguments of why that might be. It might be lifestyle, it might be healthy worker effect. I think you might want to consider, are you considered radiation workers? Not yet,
Not
eh?
officially.
You don't want
Well,
to.
they reclassified us at one point in time because, because the studies had shown that we were actually starting to exceed the limit.
You're probably getting,
But it was,
yeah, some of these pilots are getting way more, not way more, but they're getting more than a nuclear energy worker would get by a long shot.
Yeah.
And
And
that's
then-
because there's no radiation exposures around nuclear power
Yeah,
stations.
and then they changed the actual, whatever we fall into.
All right. So they modified it.
Yeah, and so ours is the same.
I would say I'd put you in the same category. I don't
think we're
know.
at 6 or something.
And if you look at this book that was published by a guy named Chuck Saunders, he put together a whole bunch of all sorts of different types of cancers in nuclear energy workers and looked at the relative risk of dying of cancer based on your dose of radiation that you get. And this is not annual dose, this is lifetime dose. So it's really low. I mean, but if you look at the green line here represents a relative risk of 1, which is no increased risk. And all the black symbols represent studies that show the risk of getting cancer, whether the black studies show that it's below the line of 1, which means the risk is less. And the red dots represent, at least according to the authors, studies that show a significant increased risk of above 1 of getting cancer. So blacks are below the line, reds are above, decreased risk, increased risk, related to dose that you get over your lifetime. And it seems fairly convincing that many of them fall below the risk of 1, which means there's less risk in these dose ranges until about 100 again. And remember I told you 100 is about where we start seeing things in A-bomb survivors, where there's still studies that show that it may not be increased, but there's some that show there's increase. And certainly the red ones are above the line at the higher dose range, but not below. Again, so just sort of putting sort of what we know in terms of radiation workers and total dose and risk together. Here's his book. I put in there for a reference for you. We spend a lot of money protecting ourselves from radiation. It's one of the biggest sort of expenditures we have in terms of life saved. If you look at studies that look at how much money do you spend to save a human life? Well, if it's your life, you want to spend billions, right? But if you look at society and how much money we actually have to spend, the economists will put this into perspective in terms of regulations that cost more than $15 million per expected life saved will have a counterproductive effect on individual mortality. Well, how does that work? Well, it means that we're spending more money than we should to save one life when that valuable resource should be used where we can save lives a lot more efficiently and a lot easier and a lot more of them. And there's a chart showing in 2010 dollars, example of life-saving interventions and their cost effectiveness in terms of dollars. I know you can't read the numbers, but if we look at what we've been doing in terms of radiation protection, how much we were allowed to get over the years in terms of millisieverts per year. When we first started and we didn't know what the heck we were doing until we figured out something's going on here if we get too much. We've been lowering and lowering and lowering and lowering the regulations until we're down to here where we're sitting at around 20 millisieverts a year as the current regulation. And you look at the cost that it incurs to have safety at this level and look at all these different things. I look at highway safety, National Highway Safety Administration. It costs about, per life year saved, 0.11 million, so 110,000 per person that you save. But you go all the way down the list till you get into the radiation control, emission standards, NRC. We're dropping about $3.8 billion per life saved using these standards, which some people...
Per life year saved.
Per life year saved, yeah. So you're looking at a significant investment in money, and some people are starting to argue, have we gone too far with this? Are we spending a lot more money than we need to? And these are all hypothetical lives that are based on an LNT model. So again, I can see in the next 10 years or 20 years we're going to have some serious challenges to a lot of the things we do with respect to radiation protection. I believe that's my last slide. So in conclusion, you have to say that we have biological defense mechanisms that protect us against high doses of radiation. This is what happened when the atomic bomb survivors were irradiated. They were irradiated. Lots of damage happened. Many of them survived because they had defense mechanisms to keep them alive to see tomorrow. But it involved a risk that we saw 10 or 20 years down the road, or even 30 years. The risk was, well, you might get cancer, but the benefit was we're going to keep you alive today and for the next 30 years. That's the defense mechanisms. We have them. They work great at high doses. At certain doses, there's too much, we get overwhelmed, they become lethal. And then at the lower doses, I say we have these genetic response mechanisms that are adapting daily to all sorts of perturbations and changes in our systems. And when we get a chest X-ray, or when we get a little bit extra background radiation from something, or we do this, our body adapts to it. Because like I said before, radiation is just causing free radicals and ions to form in your body. They happen all the time when you breathe air, you breathe oxygen, you exercise. We get hundreds of these things happening every second, and our body just deals with them through our defense mechanisms. So I call these response mechanisms to low doses, and I always put on my apple and orange, so people shouldn't get the two confused, because they're actually two different things we're talking about. High doses, defense mechanisms; low doses, response mechanism. That's the end of my talk, except for we're all done picking ice wine. In fact, ice wine was really bad this year in our vineyards. We hardly had I think we got a couple of days where we got to the minus. We got all the ice wine off, but that's just a picture of us picking our ice wine in our vineyard in Niagara a few years back. Anyways, hope that gave you some information, and